here in Vancouver, here in the West Coast. We are delighted to be together. Welcome to all of you who are here with us in person, and welcome to all of you who join us online from anywhere around the world you may be. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent, and also this year's Evening Public Lecture Coordinator. As we start, we would like to acknowledge that Regent College sits on the traditional and ceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam First Nations people. Before we start, I would like to remind you, if you have already subscribed to newsletter emails, you will know how relevant it is to be up to date about everything that is happening here at Regent. Events, lectures, resources, lots of information. If you have not subscribed yet, I would like to invite you to subscribe. All you have to do is to grab one of these little blue cards. They are all the way to the back by the donations box. And on the blue side, you can follow a link where you can register digitally. On the white side, it is an option for you if you would like to enter your name and email address, and we will register you. But either way, this is the best way to be up to date and well informed about everything that is happening here at Regent. Before we start, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, right now is the time to put it on a silent mode. So any electronic device that may produce any sound, please put it on silent mode, and we will really appreciate it. And lastly, those of you who join us here in person, please be reminded that tonight we are recording and live streaming this event under the conditions spelled out by the public notice posted on the doors of Regent and here on the doors of, at the doors of Chapel. At this point, I would like to introduce Richard Thompson. He is our Director of Advancement here at Regent, and he will be our host tonight. Richard.
Well, let me add my welcome to Pablo's. So good to see you here tonight. And a very warm welcome back to Dr. Brittany Kim. She was first with us 2 years ago in the summer of 23. And I think it's fair to say that she enjoyed her time and that her students enjoyed her, that we felt we should invite her back, and clearly she was willing to accept. So we're really glad you're here with us tonight. In a moment, I will more formally introduce Dr. Brittany Kim to you. Let me just explain how the evening unfolds. For many of you who I've seen many times over the years, you know the routine, but for those who might be here for the first time for an evening public lecture, after I introduce Dr. Kim, she will lecture for about 50 minutes or so. Following that time, we will have a question and answer period. For those that are gathered here in person, you'll notice microphones on either side of the auditorium at the back. We ask you to make your way to those microphones to ask a question so that it can be heard by everyone here and so that it's also captured in the recording of tonight's lecture. For those who are online, you can submit your questions at any time to an email address, which is questions@regent-college.edu. And for those of you that are gathered here who might be shy or not prone to get up to a microphone and ask a question out loud, you can take that cell phone of yours, which is silent, and enter your question and email it, and it will get read by Pablo. So you have two ways of asking your questions if you're present. Our online audience has the one. And then we will conclude our evening by around 9 o'clock, and so we're in for a great evening. Let me tell you a little bit about our lecturer. Dr. Brittany Kim is an editing scholar at the BibleProject and one of the founding directors of Every Voice, which provides resources to support greater ethnic diversity in Christian theological education. Thank you and bless you for that. She is the author of Lengthen Your Tent-Cords, the metaphorical world of Israel's household in the book of Isaiah, as well as a number of essays. She co-authored with Charlie Trimm, Understanding Old Testament Theology, Mapping the Terrain of Recent Approaches. And Brittany is interested in literary methods, intertextuality, biblical theology, and contextual interpretation. And as a trained spiritual director, she brings a formational lens to her teaching and writing. Thank you and bless you for that too. She lives in Chicago with her husband Ted and their 3 children. And her husband Ted is the pastor of Evanston Vineyard Church. But you are not accompanied by neither Ted nor the children this week, just you. Well, we're really glad you're here. Dr. Kim is teaching the course Genesis, the Foundations of the Biblical Story. It is indeed that, is it not? And I think we are going to hear a little bit from part of the book of Genesis with your lecture tonight, which we are very much looking forward to. So without further ado, would you join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Brittany Kim?
I'm delighted to be back here this year and to get this chance to present to all of you. So thank you for the invitation. And I do just want to say that I am working for BibleProject, but I'm not representing BibleProject as I'm speaking tonight, but my own wrestlings with the text and with the characters of Hagar and Leah, which have been so deeply transformative for me. So when we read Genesis 12 through 50, we tend to focus on God's covenant promises to Abraham, tracing how his promises of descendants, land, and blessing passed down through the later generations of Israel's patriarchs, to Isaac, then to Jacob, and finally to Jacob's 12 sons. Often, we give little more than a sideways glance at the female characters who dot these pages, especially those who are overlooked or rejected by the patriarchs themselves, like Hagar and Leah. But when we dive into their stories, we find that God does not overlook them, and neither does the biblical author. These women's stories testify to a God who sees those who are despised, lonely, outcast, despairing. God recognizes the harm that is done to them and responds with compassionate care, providing for their needs and raising them up to a place of honor. Exploring how God sees these women who reside on the margins of the biblical story can help us open our eyes to see how he sees the people who reside on the margins of our communities, as well as how he sees us whenever we feel overlooked or rejected. The story of Hagar begins when Abram, later called Abraham, and Sarai, later called Sarah, grow weary of waiting for God to fulfill his promise to give them a child, and so they decide to help him out. Following a common ancient Near Eastern practice for dealing with barrenness, Sarai instructs Abram to take her Egyptian slave woman, Hagar, as a second wife to produce a child through her. And then it says, "And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai." Here, the narrator is hyperlinking to an earlier passage in Genesis to help us assess what's happening. In the Garden of Eden, after Eve eats fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and gives some to Adam, who also eats, it says, "And to the man God said, 'Because you listened to the voice of your wife and ate from the tree which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground because of you. In painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life.'" God explicitly condemns Adam's decision, noting that it will lead to serious consequences. Now, this is not saying that men should never listen to their wives. In fact, God will later tell Abraham that he should listen to Sarah in a particular instance. But in Genesis 3, Adam listened to his wife instead of God, who had already explicitly told him not to eat from that tree. The narrator uses this hyperlink to cue us to the fact that Genesis 16 presents a similar situation. In the previous chapter, when Abram despaired of having any descendants and suggested that his servant should be his heir, God said, "This man will not be your heir, but one who comes out of your own loins, he will be your heir." And God brought him outside and said, "Look at the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to them, "So will your offspring be." And he believed Yahweh, and he counted it to him as righteousness. At first, Abram believes God's promise. But then, as time passes and it doesn't come to fruition, he allows Sarai's voice to drown out God's. Like Adam, he doesn't reach out to God for help in discerning what to do, but simply acts at his wife's prompting. Also, just as Eve took the fruit and gave it to her husband, so it says that Sarai took Hagar and gave her to her husband, treating her as an object to be possessed at will. Hagar's consent is never sought. The plan works, and Hagar conceives a child, but like Adam, Abram will also face consequences for his choice to disregard God's words. In this case, long-term conflict within his household, beginning when Hagar's response to her pregnancy angers Sarai. Many translations have something like, "When Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress." But the word translated as despise is the Hebrew verb kalal, which in the kal stem often means to be light. So we might instead translate the verse as, "And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was light in her eyes." Now, up till now, Hagar has merely been a foreign slave in Sarai's household. But now she's carrying her master's child. Perhaps Sarai is light in her eyes because she feels that her status has been elevated, up to or even above her barren mistress. So Sarai's reaction might be because Hagar is no longer giving her the deference she thinks she's due. But even if we understand Hagar as despising Sarai here, we should remember that Sarai has pushed Hagar into Abram's embrace and now plans to take Hagar's child as her own. As Hagar begins to feel tiny flutters growing into insistent kicks, she knows that the baby growing in her womb will grow up as Sarai's child. So Wilda Gaffney asks, why should a sex slave forced into gestating someone else's child think highly of or bless her enslaver? Like Adam and Eve before her, when Sarai finds herself in the pit she dug, she responds by casting blame, saying to Abram, "My harm is upon you. I gave my slave woman into your bosom, and she sees that she is conceived, and I am light in her eyes. May Yahweh judge between me and between you." But God is silent, perhaps because neither of them are really seeking his assessment. And Abram pushes the ball back into Sarai's court. "Behold, your slave woman is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your eyes." Again, like Adam and Eve, Sarai chooses to decide what's good and evil for herself. And what's good in her eyes is retribution. And Sarai oppressed her, and she fled from her. We might expect that that would be the last we hear about Hagar, and that the camera would stay on Abram and Sarai. But instead, the camera follows Hagar into exile. And the angel of Yahweh, who represents Yahweh himself, found her near a spring of water in the wilderness, near the spring on the way to Shur. When God gets involved, he appears not to Abram or Sarai, but to Hagar. And it's interesting that it says that the angel of Yahweh found her. I don't think that means that God didn't know where she was, but instead conveys the idea that he was actively seeking her. Then the angel says, "Hagar, slave woman of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" Notice that unlike Abram and Sarai, who only ever call Hagar slave woman, the angel calls her by name. And he asks her where she's come from, not because he doesn't know, after all, he identifies her as Sarai's slave woman, but because he's giving her an opportunity to consider her situation. She responds, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai," answering only the angel's first question, not the second question about where she's going. Perhaps she makes no response to that because she doesn't have a plan. Shur is south of Canaan, so the fact that she's on the road to Shur may suggest that she's headed back toward Egypt, her homeland. But maybe she's realized that she doesn't really have anywhere to go. We know nothing about why she was enslaved, but she may no longer have any family, or at least no family with the means to provide for her. So the angel speaks to her again. Return to your mistress and allow yourself to be oppressed under her hand. Now, why would God call Hagar to return to such a difficult situation? Many readers, especially those who have suffered oppression, have struggled with God's command here. Reading this narrative with a group of Black South African women, Nicole Simopoulos observes that they viewed the God portrayed in this passage as the God of the powerful and not the God of the poor. Why would a God of justice, a God who seeks the peace and well-being of his creation, call a vulnerable woman to return to a situation of oppression? We may wonder if God is on the side of Abram and Sarai and not on the side of Hagar. But as we continue the story, we see that God follows this instruction with incredible promise, showing his concern for Hagar's future. So I think he calls her to return in part because it's the best option for the survival of both her and her child. The desolate wilderness is not a hospitable place for her to birth her baby or raise him during those first few perilous years. Infant and maternal mortality rates were high in the ancient world, and Hagar is all alone with no one to help her. Now, I want to be clear that this passage should not be used to counsel people to remain in situations of abuse today. This instruction was given specifically to Hagar and in a culture where there were no other safety nets for her to rely on. Thankfully, in our modern world, we have many organizations and legal provisions that can help people get free from abusive environments. But it's also worth noting here another significant hyperlink. A different form of the same Hebrew verb that I've translated as allow yourself to be oppressed, ana, is found in the prior chapter where God says to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be foreigners in a land that does not belong to them, and they will enslave them and oppress them for 400 years. The Bible never clearly explains why God allows the Israelites to suffer in slavery in Egypt for centuries. But I think it's helpful to note that God doesn't require anything of Hagar that isn't also required of Israel. In fact, the Hebrew word translated as foreigners in Genesis 15:13 is gar, which many scholars connect to Hagar's name. At least in the original consonantal Hebrew text, Hagar could simply mean the foreigner. So Hagar's story mirrors Israel's. She too is enslaved and oppressed as a foreigner in a land not her own. Hagar's story also mirrors Israel's in another important way, through the promises God gives her. The angel continues, I will surely multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to be counted. This echoes God's words to Abram in the prior chapter, where God brought him outside and said, look at the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so will your offspring be. So Susan Piggott calls Hagar the mother patriarch, saying, as the only matriarch promised multiplied seed, she is the mother patriarch. As an Egyptian, she is the ultimate other, an outsider, stranger, and a slave, who mirrors the patriarchs in her encounters with God and in her actions, making Hagar the other patriarch. Later, after Hagar's son Ishmael is born, God echoes this verse again when he reiterates his covenant promise to Abram, saying, and I will make my covenant between me and between you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Then God changes Abram's name to Abraham, which means father of many, saying, "For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations." God explains that Sarah too will have a son named Isaac, who will be Abraham's covenant heir. But the multitude of nations will include not just the Israelites who descend from Sarah, but also the Ishmaelites who come from Hagar's womb. Both are the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. God also tells Abraham, "And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him and make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He will father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation." And here God applies language to Ishmael taken from his initial calling of Abraham, where he said, "And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you may be a blessing." God's 3 covenant promises are descendants, land, and blessing. Although Ishmael will not inherit the promised land of Canaan, he too receives promises of descendants and blessing. And we also learn in Genesis 17 that Ishmael receives the covenant mark of circumcision. So Safwat Marzuk sees Ishmael's identity as an interstitial character that is simultaneously an insider and an outsider. He continues, "Ishmael represents the wild that escapes rigid categories. He represents those who are in between." Perhaps another reason that God sends Hagar back to Sarai is so that Ishmael will be raised to know the God of Abram and will bear the mark of the covenant in his flesh, so that he will be an insider and not just an outsider. Returning to Hagar's encounter with God in the wilderness in Genesis 16, the angel also says, "Behold, you are pregnant and will bear a son, and you will call his name Ishmael, for Yahweh has heard of your oppression." This declaration resembles birth announcements found throughout the Bible, but it's closest in form to the announcement of a sign given to King Ahaz in Isaiah 7:14. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the young woman is pregnant and will bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. And of course, the Gospel of Matthew explains that this promise reaches its ultimate fulfillment in the birth of Jesus. These striking verbal parallels connect the Emmanuel child not with Sarah's son Isaac, but with Ishmael, the half-Egyptian son of the slave woman Hagar. Ishmael, too, is a sign that God is with us, and not just with those who reside in the center, but also with those who inhabit the margins. In fact, Ishmael's name means God hears. So Ishmael stands as a symbol of how God hears the cries of the oppressed, no matter what their background or social status. As Hagar returns to Sarai and endures her mistreatment, every time she calls Ishmael's name, it will be a reminder that she is not forgotten. Her suffering does not escape God's notice. The angel continues with words that may seem on the surface to offer a more negative portrait of Ishmael. The NIV is representative of most English translations when it reads, "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." In the last line, the idea of hostility arises from understanding the combined preposition al pene as adversative, meaning against. But more often, it has a spatial meaning of before or in the presence of. So that line could also be translated as, "And he will live in the presence of all his brothers." Of course, the idea of conflict is still found in the second line, but the reference to everyone is likely hyperbolic, and Israel too will spend many of its days embroiled in conflict with the surrounding nations. Skirmishes between people groups were a way of life in the ancient world. And finally, although we tend to have negative associations with donkeys, turning them into a disparaging epithet, for the ancient Israelites, the primary association may have been freedom to roam. As God reminds Job of his creative power, he says, "Who sent out the wild donkey free? And who loosed the bonds of the wild ass?" As Tony Maloof puts it, thus, an enslaved and powerless Hagar, fleeing from affliction under Sarah, received a promise of a son who would, in contrast, be free and strong as a nomad, surviving through power struggle in the wilderness. The image of Ishmael running free like a wild donkey must have made Hagar's heart swell with hope. Hagar responds to God's promises by calling the name of Yahweh, who spoke to her, "You are the God of seeing." For she said, "I have now seen after the one who sees me." Remarkably, Hagar is the only person in the Bible said to name God, Kara Shem. And the name she gives him recognizes that he attends to her suffering when no one else does. Hagar also celebrates the fact that God has given her the honor of seeing him. God comes down to meet with her in her place of desperation and offers her incredible promises for the future of her unborn child. And her encounter with God is memorialized in the name given to that place, Be'er Lahai Roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. Returning to Abram's household, Hagar safely delivers Ishmael, and the narrative picks up her story again years later after Sarah has borne Isaac. When Abraham throws a party to celebrate Isaac being weaned, it says, "And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. And she said to Abraham, 'Cast out this maidservant with her son, for the son of this maidservant will not inherit with my son, with Isaac.'" Now, given Sarah's strong reaction to Ishmael's behavior, many English translations interpret his actions negatively, assuming that he was mocking Isaac. But the Hebrew verb tzachak is the standard verb for laughing, and it often has a positive connotation. It may be that the author is making a play on words, since this Hebrew verb forms the basis of Isaac's name, Yitzchak in Hebrew. In other words, the idea may be that Ishmael is Isaacing, perhaps enjoying privileges that Sarah thinks should belong only to Isaac. However we understand Ishmael's actions, Sarah responds by demanding that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away so that Ishmael won't present a challenge to Isaac's inheritance. At first, Abraham is reluctant. The matter was very evil in the eyes of Abraham on account of his son. But then God intervenes, saying, "Let it not be evil in your eyes on account of the boy and on account of your maidservant." Now, notice that God's words form a tight parallel to the narrative description of Abraham's distress, except that while Abraham is concerned only about his son, God reminds him that the situation also affects the boy's mother. So although God is telling him not to be distressed, he may also be subtly rebuking Abraham for failing to consider Hagar. God continues saying, "Everything that Sarah says to you, listen to your voice, for your offspring will be reckoned to you through Isaac. And also, I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation because he is your offspring." The family conflict began when Abraham listened to Sarai's voice without seeking God's counsel, but now God tells him to do as she says. God will bless Isaac and Ishmael. Both will become great nations, but their futures will be separate, and only Isaac will be full heir to the covenant. So Abraham immediately follows God's instructions. And Abraham arose early in the morning, and he took bread and a skin of water, and he gave them to Hagar and set them on her shoulder. And with the boy he sent her away. And she went and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Now, I think it's important to note that while God does tell Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, he doesn't tell him how to send them away. We know that Abraham has become quite wealthy by this point, loaded with silver and gold, livestock and slaves. So we might expect that he would send Hagar and Ishmael away with donkeys laden with supplies and slaves to help care for their needs and offer protection. Instead, he sends them off with bread and a skin of water, no more provisions than Hagar can carry on her shoulder. So soon they find themselves in a desperate situation. And when the water from the skin was finished, she cast the boy under one of the bushes, and she went and sat opposite him about a bow shot away. For she said, "I cannot see the boy die." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. Abraham was initially hesitant to comply with Sarah's demand because of his concern for his son, but by sending them away without the resources to survive, he brings Ishmael to the brink of death. But as Hagar languishes in despair and grief, God meets her once again. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, and he said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is there. Arise, lift up the boy and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." And then it says that God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin of water and gave the boy a drink. Fulfilling the meaning of Ishmael's name, God hears the boy's cries, and then he reiterates his promise to make him into a great nation. We might wonder, though, why the angel begins by asking Hagar what is the matter. It seems pretty clear what the problem is. Their skin of water is empty, and Ishmael is dying of thirst. But notice how Hagar receives the water she so desperately needs. It doesn't say that God brought water out of a rock, like he does later when Israel is thirsty in the wilderness. Instead, it says that he opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water that was already there. In other words, God has already provided for her. And perhaps the angel's question offers an invitation for her to reconsider her situation in light of God's earlier promises and start looking for God's provision. Although this painting by Marc Chagall doesn't show the well, it captures the image of Hagar's despair while God's deliverance is already at hand. But why would God tell Abraham to listen to Sarah and send Hagar and Ishmael away in the first place? I think the biblical author wants us to see that Sarah's jealous demand is not an obstacle to God's plan to bring about flourishing for Hagar and Ishmael. God actually accomplishes his good purposes through it. What Sarah intends as an exile, God intends as an Exodus deliverance. Just as Hagar was cast out, garash, and sent away, shalach, so later God tells Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will send them away, shalach, and with a strong hand he will cast them out, garash." The same words that describe Israel's exodus from oppressive slavery in Egypt are used to describe the Egyptian Hagar's exodus from oppressive slavery to Abraham and Sarah. The story ends by saying, "And God was with the boy, and he grew up and lived in the wilderness and became an archer. And while he was living in the wilderness of Paran, his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt." God's presence remains with Ishmael and Hagar as they make their home in the wilderness. And returning to her roots in the land of her birth, Hagar once again acts as the mother patriarch by finding a wife for her son so that God can fulfill his blessing to make Ishmael into a great nation. As Phyllis Tribble observes, the story of Hagar speaks to all who have been afflicted or marginalized. As a symbol of the oppressed, Hagar becomes many things to many people. Most especially, all sorts of rejected women find their stories in her. She is the faithful maid exploited, the black woman used by the male and abused by the female of the ruling class, the surrogate mother, the resident alien without legal recourse, the young woman alone, or the other woman, the runaway youth, the religious fleeing from affliction, the pregnant young woman alone, the expelled wife, the divorced mother with child, the shopping bag lady carrying bread and water, the homeless woman, the indigent relying on handouts from the power structures, the welfare mother, and the self-effacing female whose own identity shrinks in service to others. Hagar's story is a reminder that God hears the cries of those who are oppressed, outcast, despairing. God cares for every person he has carefully formed in his image, and he sees those who are unseen. Decades later, Sarah's son Isaac has twin boys after his wife Rebekah suffers an initial period of barrenness. The younger son, Jacob, connives to manipulate his older brother Esau into selling him his birthright, the double portion of the inheritance given to the oldest son. And then later, he deceives his father to steal the blessing intended for his brother, forcing him to flee to avoid Esau's retribution. So his mother sends him to stay with her brother Laban's family in Haran, instructing him to find a wife there. And after working for his uncle for a month, Laban invites him to name his wages. At this point in the story, we learn a bit more about Laban's family. We've already been introduced to his daughter Rachel because Jacob met her at the communal well when he first arrived in town. But now we learn that Laban also has an older daughter, Leah. And the narrative describes them by saying, "Now the eyes of Leah were rachot, and, or but, Rachel was beautiful of form and beautiful of appearance." But what exactly it means for Leah's eyes to be rachot is a matter of some debate. The NASB translates, "And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful." In other words, it understands the verse as presenting a stark contrast between Leah and Rachel, suggesting perhaps that Leah had some kind of problem with her eyes, or that they were unattractive. But while that Hebrew word can mean weak, for example, describing a fearful soldier as weak of heart, it's also used of a tender calf and soft words. So some interpreters view the description of Leah more positively. The NRSV reads, "Leah's eyes were lovely, and Rachel was graceful and beautiful." However we understand the description of Leah, the narrative is clear that Rachel's beauty is unsurpassed, and Jacob loves Rachel. So he says to Laban, "Let me serve you for 7 years in exchange for your younger daughter, Rachel." For many of us in the modern Western world, this idea of working to purchase a bride feels strange and distasteful. But in the ancient world, for a man to marry, he needed to pay his wife's family a bride price. And since Jacob fled from Esau with little more than the clothes on his back, he has nothing to offer. So he intends to earn a bride price by working for Laban. And Laban agrees to his terms, and it says that Jacob served 7 years in exchange for Rachel, but in his eyes they were like a few days because of his love for her. But when the 7 years are up, Laban doesn't automatically give Rachel to Jacob. So when Jacob approaches Laban, demanding, "Give me my wife, for my days are complete, so that I may go into her," Laban complies by preparing a wedding feast. But then he engages in subterfuge. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah, and he brought her to Jacob, and he went in to her. And when morning came, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you in exchange for Rachel? And why have you deceived me?" Laban justifies himself by saying, "It is not done so in our place to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week for this one, and we will give you also that one in exchange for the service you will serve with me for another 7 years. This episode contains some key hyperlinks back to earlier points in Jacob's narrative. When Isaac's wife Rebekah is pregnant, God tells her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from your belly will be separated. And one people will be stronger than the other, and the greater will serve the younger, using the same Hebrew word sa'ir. But Jacob doesn't wait for God to bring about that future. Instead, he takes matters into his own hands, deceiving his father to steal his brother's blessing. And when Jacob comes to his father, he says, I am Esau, your firstborn. Bachor, from the same Hebrew root as Bakir. He continues, I did as you told me. Arise now, sit and eat from my game so that you may bless me. And later, when Esau discovers what Jacob has done, he says, isn't his name rightly called Jacob, which can mean deceiver? He deceived me these 2 times. He took my birthright, using another related word, bachorah, and behold, now he has taken my blessing, barakah, which is a different Hebrew root, but forms a wordplay. So Laban gives Jacob a taste of his own medicine. The deceiver has become the deceived, and the narrator uses Laban's words to offer a subtle rebuke of Jacob's trickery. But in all of Laban's scheming, he doesn't consider Leah. She is a pawn in her father's game. The story doesn't tell us anything about her experience, but we can imagine her anguish as the unwanted wife so quickly supplanted by her younger sister. But then Leah's fortunes change. And Yahweh saw that Leah was hated, and he opened her womb. But Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, for Yahweh has seen my affliction. Surely now my husband will love me. The Hebrew word sanah doesn't necessarily convey the same kind of active dislike that we tend to associate with the English word hate. It can also describe disregarding or rejecting someone. But either way, whether Jacob feels an active dislike or passive disregard, he does not truly see Leah. But God does. Just as he earlier saw Hagar in her despair, now he sees Leah and responds to her plight with attentive care. Now, I want to note that Rachel is not punished with barrenness for being Jacob's beloved. Instead, she participates, along with Israel's other foremothers, Sarah and Rebekah, in a pattern of barrenness that ultimately displays God's power and faithfulness. For whatever reason, God allows these women's wombs to remain closed for a lengthy season, ultimately revealing that he alone brings his promise of descendants to fruition by allowing them to conceive. But like Hagar, Leah avoids the pain of that period of barrenness. God opens her womb, giving her the great honor that childbearing afforded women in the ancient world. While Hagar memorializes God's loving concern by naming him as the God of seeing, Leah inscribes it in the name of her firstborn son. Reuben literally means, see, a son. It's an exclamation of surprise and delight that she has borne a child. But Hagar also connects his name to God seeing her. For both Hagar and Leah, the birth of their firstborn son is tied to God perceiving their oni, that is, their affliction or oppression. Although Leah hangs her hopes on earning her husband's love through childbearing, it doesn't do the trick. But she recognizes that God's compassionate concern never wavers. When she bears a second son, she says, for Yahweh has heard that I am hated, and he has given me this one too. And she called his name Simeon, which, like Ishmael, comes from the Hebrew root for hearing. When she has her third son, she again expresses hope that she will gain Jacob's favor, saying, "Now this time my husband will be attached to me, for I have borne him 3 sons." Therefore she called his name Levi. But finally, she seems to give up on Jacob's affections. When she bears a 4th son, she says, "This time I will praise Yahweh." Therefore she called his name Judah, from that same Hebrew root. Leah has children but no love. Rachel has love but no children, and both women struggle with what they lack. So, envious of Leah's motherhood, Rachel decides to take a page out of Sarah's book and give her slave woman Bilhah to Jacob to bear children through her. Through this scheme, Rachel gains 2 sons, giving them names that reflect her conflict with her sister. When Bilhah bears her first son, Rachel says, "God has judged me, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Now, given how we saw the slave woman as surrogate situation play out in Abraham's family, we might question Rachel's assessment of the situation. Does Bilhah bearing a child really suggest that God has judged in her favor? And yet, the story of Hagar also prepares us to expect that God will enfold Bilhah's children into his plans to bring about blessing through Abraham's family. When Bilhah bears another son, Rachel says, "With the wrestlings of God," or perhaps mighty wrestlings, "I have wrestled with my sister, and I have also prevailed." And she called his name Naphtali. Now, Rachel has Jacob's affection and 2 surrogate sons. So she feels that she has come out on top in her rivalry with Leah, which mirrors the rivalry of Jacob and Esau. But if Abraham's family is going to bring blessing to the nations by modeling the true life that's found in following God's ways, their relationships with one another should be marked by generosity and love, rather than competition and conquest. Although Leah seemed to find some contentment with the birth of Judah, Rachel's maneuverings spark her envy. So she copies Rachel's move, giving her slave woman Zilpah to Jacob as a wife. And when she also bears 2 sons, Leah gives them names that reflect delight. And Leah said, "Good fortune," and she called his name Gad. And with the second, she said, "Happy am I, for the daughters call me happy." And she called his name Asher. But I wonder if these names are simply feeble attempts to convince herself of her joy by stating how she should feel or how others see her. The story continues by telling us that Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and he brought them to his mother Leah. In the ancient world, mandrakes were viewed as an aphrodisiac and aid to conception. And although Rachel now has 2 surrogate children, she still hasn't brought forth any children from her own womb. So, hoping that they might help her get pregnant, Rachel says, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But Leah bitterly exclaims, "Is it a small thing that you have taken my husband? And would you also take my son's mandrakes?" Now, the mandrakes may seem like a small thing in comparison to taking her husband, but Leah recognizes what they represent: Rachel's chance at bearing a child of her own. As Leah lives year after year in Jacob's household, unwanted and neglected, the only honor she can hold on to is that her own womb has produced sons. So Rachel negotiates, saying, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." If we're listening for them, we may hear echoes of Jacob manipulating Esau into selling his birthright over a bowl of stew. The passage doesn't record Leah's response, but apparently she agrees to the arrangement, because when Jacob comes in from the field, Leah tells him, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." The passage doesn't give us any insight into Leah's feelings here, but I would imagine she must have felt significant shame telling her own husband that she'd had to pay to sleep with him, especially in an ancient culture where sexual control typically lay in the hands of men. But for whatever reason, Jacob goes along with the plan, perhaps because he understands how important the mandrakes must be to Rachel. And Leah's exchange pays off. But notice that the passage attributes the outcome to God. And God heard Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah recognizes God's intervention, but misidentifies its cause, seeing it as God paying her back for her own schemes with Zilpah. God has given my wage because I gave my slave woman to my husband, and she called his name Issachar, from the Hebrew word for hire or wage. But God is not involved in the quid pro quo system that Rachel and Leah are operating in, nor does he reward Leah for further complicating the family dynamics by giving Jacob a fourth wife. God simply hears Leah in her misery and shame, as he did before, and he graciously bestows on her the honor of bearing a fifth son. And God's generous care for Leah continues as she bears a sixth son. And Leah said, God has bestowed on me a good gift. This time my husband will honor me, for I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun. Zebulun's name comes from the Hebrew root zaval, which Leah uses to talk about the honor she anticipates from Jacob. But in a wordplay, Leah also connects Zebulun's name to the similar sounding root zavad, noting that this son is a good gift from God. And then finally, Leah bears a daughter, giving her the name Dinah. Although she doesn't make any comment on the girl's name, it seems to come from the same root as Bilhah's son Dan. Perhaps Leah feels that by giving her 7 children, God has judged in her favor. Despite her conviction that after 6 sons, her husband would sit up and take note, nothing is said about a change in her marriage. But even if Jacob never honors her, the biblical text does. After this, Leah as a character essentially disappears from the scene. We see her a handful of times in connection with the rest of her family, but she doesn't really act on her own. And since God finally allows Rachel to bear 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, we might think that she gets the last word, claiming victory in the tragic sisterly battle. But as the story continues, we see that God does not allow Leah to be forgotten. Jacob bypasses Leah's sons when he assigns the double portion of the inheritance typically given to the oldest son to Rachel's firstborn Joseph by counting Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own. But it is Leah's son Judah who becomes the father of Israel's kings. When Jacob blesses his sons near the end of his life, he says, Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches, he lies down like a lion, and like a lion, who will rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him and the people's obedience belongs to him. Binding his donkey to a vine and his donkey's colt to a choice vine, he washes his garments in wine and his robes in the blood of grapes. So Leah becomes an ancestor of King David and later of Jesus, the true king over all the earth who will rule in righteousness and justice forever. And she also becomes the foremother of Israel's priests when the priesthood is given to the tribe of Levi in Exodus 32. And although Rachel dies while the family is traveling from Bethel to Ephrath and is buried somewhere along the way, Jacob notes that he buried Leah in the family tomb near Hebron, along with Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah. And there, Jacob too is later buried when he dies. So the nearness Leah desired in life, she gains in death, as she lies entombed with Jacob, her bones resting together with him and with his family forever. Examining the stories of Hagar and Leah reveals a God who sees the unloved, the outcast, the despairing, and who responds with compassionate care, abundantly providing for their needs and turning shame into honor. If we focus solely on Abraham and the male heirs who carry on his covenant line, then we miss something, or rather, someones, that both God and the biblical author want us to see. Following their gaze to the characters of Hagar and Leah can make us more attuned to how God attentively cares for us when we too feel disregarded, forgotten, or rejected. And it can train us to open our eyes to the people around us that we may have overlooked. People we may not have seen as that important, but who are worthy of our attention because they are worthy of God's attention and because they reflect God's image back to us. Thank you.
Brittany, thank you for a wonderful lecture, insightful, challenging, especially with that final challenge that we as God's people need to be those who see and hear and notice those on the margins and neglected. So we are deeply grateful for your lecture tonight. And there are already people lined up at the microphone, but let me just quickly remind everyone again, for those in person, please make your way to the microphone on either side, and I'll be attentive to both sides so that the questions are received in order. And of course, you here can type in a question on your phone and send it to regent-college.edu. We do have our first question, so please.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. I'm not sure if this is a good question or a question that has an answer. I'm wondering about the writers of Genesis were also in this same culture, in this culture where oppression of women would have been normal. So I'm just wondering, what is it that they saw that allowed them to see these women?
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to that question, but it makes it all the more remarkable that these are not people who are writing from our cultural perspective that has a little bit different view, but somehow they gained God's sight to see Hagar and Leah the way that God wanted them to. And yeah, I think we should be surprised at how much attention is given to Hagar in the narrative. That's something that we wouldn't expect, and so yeah, it's something we want to make sure we grab hold of.
I'm sorry that if my question is a little bit controversial or outside your wheelhouse or scope of expertise. And my battery just died, so I'll try to remember it in my head. But hey, at Regent, we like to ask you questions and shake things up, right? So in light of Hagar and Ishmael, in that context, I know some Christians and some Jewish traditions that believe that Arab Muslims are the descendants of in the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran insinuates that he himself is a descendant of Ishmael. And so I have a two-part question. One part, do you see any biblical evidence to support this idea that Arab Muslims are the descendants of Ishmael? And if that is the case, how then should that inform us? How should that shape our posture or our response to the oppression? How should we see and witness what's going on to Palestinians and their marginalization and their oppression in light of Israel's war on Hamas? So
Yeah.
throw that at you.
So the evidence for biological descent of all Arabs from Ishmael is, and I have not done a deep dive on this, but my understanding is that there's not very solid evidence for that. But certainly there is a connection. They see themselves, at least in terms of religious or cultural identity, as connected back to Ishmael. So I think there is a connection there. I don't know, though, how much that should affect how we view Arabs, because the point I think that I want to make from this story is that God reveals here how he cares for all people who are people created in his image, and we should view everyone as beloved creatures of God. And so as we're dealing with these kinds of conflicts, God here is not siding with one group over another. God is seeking to bring about blessing for everyone. So as we're approaching these kinds of conflicts, I think we need to resist the binaries that say you have to support this group or you have to support that group, and figure out a way to say we support the flourishing of all humankind. And what does it look like to be people who can bring peace into those situations of conflict?
Over here, please.
Hi, I'm wondering if we could just jump from Genesis into Galatians, and I'm just curious about, because Paul writes about the story of Hagar and Sarah in kind of an allegorical way, and it seems like he's interpreting that story pretty differently from the interpretation that you've been giving. It doesn't seem like he sees Hagar as a symbol of the oppressed, but he talks about them as representing the old covenant and the new covenant. And I've always found that passage kind of troubling, I guess. He's not really seeing them as real people. But he's also inspired by the Holy Spirit as he writes this. So I'm just wondering what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think for a lot of challenging New Testament uses of the Old Testament, it's helpful to recognize what they're trying to do with Scripture, with Old Testament passages, because I think we tend to assume that they are interpreting those passages, that they're saying this is what that passage means, when I think a lot of times they're actually using them in different kinds of creative ways. And Paul is not saying that this is how I would interpret that passage. He's using that passage to create an allegory that's going to shock his listeners because they think that they are the privileged children of Sarah, and now he's turning that on their head and identifying them with the slave women that they would not have, that they might have looked down on, that they would not have identified with. And he's saying that what you're doing by trying to hold fast, by trying to stay in slavery under a law that you can't actually keep, is like being the children of a slave woman. But he's not actually talking about the fate of Hagar or Ishmael, if that makes sense. He's using that story in a different way.
Please, up here.
Thank you so much. I'm curious about the names. You did a great job with all those children's names, but it seems to me there's a subtle shift between the two generations. In the Ishmael and Isaac story, the names come from Abraham or from God, but in the next story, the names come from the women.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? Is there should we read something into that shift between the namings in those the two generations?
Yeah. So, I mean, both mothers and fathers could name children. We see examples of that throughout the literature. I don't know that it's as striking that the women are the ones who are naming, but the fact that the names are not coming from God, I think, is God is involved in the childbearing. He's opening and closing wombs, but then he's sort of leaving them to this conflict on their own. And yeah, I'm not quite sure why he gives the names to that first generation and not later on. But I do think the names, it's interesting that these are the names that become the 12 tribes of Israel, right? These are the names that are kept throughout the history of Israel as a nation. And he allows those names to reflect the complicated history of their family conflicts. Yeah, I'm not sure why.
I'm curious what you would say about the sale of Joseph, and that it's the descendants of Ishmael who take Sarah's great-grandson into Egypt.
Yeah, well, and also it mentions Midianites there too, who were also Abraham's descendants through Keturah. So it's this larger family conflict that's happening here. And yeah, I think we see throughout the biblical narrative how all of these other descendants of Abraham and relatives are in tumultuous relationships. Sometimes they get along and sometimes they don't. But even within, in that story, it's Joseph's own brothers who are initiating the situation, and the Ishmaelites are participating, but they're not. They don't really probably have that much concern about what happens to Joseph. Their concern is they're headed to Egypt to sell things, and so they'll take him along if they want. But the primary conflict there is with his own immediate brothers.
Pablo, there's a question online.
No, it's my own question.
Oh, your own question. Great.
Thank you. I wonder if you can comment on the semantic range of the verb ana. Here in Hagar, we saw that in Piel and Hitpael when it means to be oppressed. But it means a lot of different things, and it comes in all stems, primarily to answer, but even to sing. So it's quite wide, the semantic range. Any comments that you will have?
Yeah, so I think the PL is basically functioning as a passive of the Hitpael is functioning as a passive of the PL. The PL has that more negative meaning of like to oppress or afflict or something. But yeah, it does have that root. And there's questions too about how many, are there different Hebrew roots with the same consonants that mean different things there? But I think generally, in the PL stem, it's sort of a negative thing, and it could be, so oppression is assuming that there is someone who is actually creating the conflict, but it can also be used of just any situation of affliction that doesn't necessarily have a human cause. So I translated it as oppress with Hagar, where there is a clear situation of mistreatment, and affliction for Leah, because although she is unloved by Jacob, he's not necessarily actually actively oppressing her. She's more just neglected, I think. But the way that the ana root is used throughout these chapters, I think, especially because of some of the other connections, like God hearing and seeing the oni of Hagar and Leah, there is a definite attempt by the author to connect the stories through the use of that keyword.
Brittany, you certainly practiced what you preached tonight in the quotations and some of the commentaries, using a variety of voices, perhaps women or groups that wouldn't normally speak into what can happen in formal theological education. Would you care to say just a word about the importance and the passion that you have for every voice?
Yeah, so without getting too much into my own story, when I was in graduate school, I often felt like I didn't quite fit, and I wasn't sure if I was a real scholar. I always felt like I was trying to sort of measure up to something and didn't always resonate with some of the things I was reading. And it wasn't until a few years after I finished my education that I started reading a lot more work by ethnic minority and female voices, and discovered that there were there were a lot of people out there who were doing scholarship in a way that actually felt more authentic to me, to who I am, who are more more relational and a little bit more integrative and not so rational, linear. And so I feel like reading voices of ethnic minority and majority world authors was like a cup of cold water in the wilderness for me. And I have learned so much from the perspectives that people who come from contexts that are not my own offer me into the biblical text. And especially with Hagar, there are a lot of people writing on Hagar from all kinds of different contexts. And I realized as I read some of their work that I had not ever seen Hagar when I had read Genesis before, because I had been reading about the covenant, that God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah, and Hagar is just an unfortunate obstacle that has to be dealt with. Until I started reading these people who are coming to the Hagar narrative from their own situations of oppression and marginalization, and that gives them a lens to be able to see that she's actually a significant character in the narrative, that the author gives a lot of space and attention to her. So that was part of my journey in working with a couple other scholars to start Every Voice. Part of our motivation is that we want to help lots of people recognize what they have to gain by hearing from a broader array of voices. And so one of the first projects we worked on is an online database of works by ethnic minority and majority world scholars. And where we have demographic information, you can search by that. So you could look at what are African women saying about the book of Ruth, or whatever. You can put in your own parameters. And, we don't always have that information, but the hope is that, because I think a lot of people say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I'd love to read more broadly, but how do I find it? So we want to try to make that work more accessible to people, and just help people to see the riches that are out there when we all learn from one another.
Thank you, Brittany. Last call for questions. Please, we still have a little bit more time.
If nobody else will. It strikes me that, and I know there's a first time principle in Scripture where God does things the first time one way and not always. But it seems that he has a chance in the Hagar story to include a foreigner right away in the line. And do you kind of sense that he's making up for that in those that are going to follow, a Moabitess, a Canaanite, a Hittite, who end up being those the foreigners in that line, and including, use the word, that inside-outside dynamic, including those outsiders in the covenant line. Do you have a sense that he's setting us up for those other people as Hagar gets that significant moment in the beginning of the Abraham and the covenant story?
I think Hagar is drawing our attention to the fact that God is working in the lives of other people who are not part of Abraham's family. I think part of the reason why Hagar does not end up included, I don't know why God only chooses one son for a couple generations there, but for whatever reason, Esau also is not a covenant heir, even though he is, same ethnic background as his brother. But God's plan from the beginning was to give Abraham a son through Sarah, and God continues with that plan, but then he also creates space for Hagar. But you do see that along the way, God is incorporating all sorts of other outsiders into Israel's line, including when Joseph is down in Egypt, he marries the daughter of an Egyptian priest, and so the tribes Ephraim and Manasseh are half Egyptian from the beginning. So, I think Hagar is a pointer toward something that will be realized in different ways at different times.
Okay, we have an online question.
No, this is my own question too.
Then, if you're going to hold your laptop like that, I'm assuming you're reading an online question, Pablo, but go ahead, we'll take the question. Last one of the night, okay.
It's just, I want to quote from your book, Understanding Old Testament Theology. It's just a quick quote.
Okay.
It says, the key distinguishing feature of Old Testament theologies that fall in this category is that they seek to retell the history of Israel. And I wonder if these stories, Hagar and Leah and a few other people, are part of that retelling of the history of Israel through women or through marginalized people or people who have a hard time for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we need to recognize, so one thing we were talking about in class this morning is that there are these little glimpses of how God is working in the lives of other people in the Old Testament, like Melchizedek, someone we came across. And we don't know we just don't have all the other stories of what God was doing in the world. But I think it is important to recognize that when we tell the story of Israel, we need to tell the story of Israel the way Israel told the story of Israel. And that includes all of these other characters who are part of that story, even if they're not the primary covenant heir or whatever. The story of Israel is expansive, and it's always, God is always bringing other people into relationship with Israel and even into Israel. Even at the Exodus, it talks about how a mixed multitude goes up with Israel. So when God makes his covenant with them at Mount Sinai, it's not just Israelites, it's a whole company of people. That needs to be part of the story of Israel that we're telling.
It would seem that is the end of our questions. Brittany, thank you for the wonderful lecture and the brilliant way in which you handled the questions. You have done a number of things for us tonight. Number one, you have equipped us to better read the text. And we will wrap up the evening early so we can all get back home and reread those Genesis narratives, because I think a lot of us are like,
there will be a quiz tomorrow.
I need to read this again. So through the hyperlinks and the word plays and the Hebrew roots, thank you. That was so instructive. And I dare say I think we all really do want to go back to the text and read what you have shown us tonight. So thank you for that. And you've comforted many of us. Perhaps there's people that have felt marginalized, ignored, not seen, not heard, and they've realized there is a God that sees and hears, so you've brought comfort. Or perhaps a lot of us are going, wow, and I thought my family was dysfunctional. God's family takes the cake, and so there's comfort there too. And thank you for giving us a challenge, that if we are going to serve the God who sees and listens, we better be people who are seeing, noticing, listening, caring for those on the margins. So for all these things, for the equipping, for the comfort, for the challenge, thank you. This has been an excellent evening. Would you join with me in thanking Dr. Brittany Kim?
Thank you.
You can either have a seat or you can take off and whatever you wish. There won't be a book signing, and I'm not going to commit Brittany to staying around longer. She has to teach again tomorrow, and she's had an exhausting schedule over the last little bit, so I want to free her up as soon as she can to go home or go to her place tonight and have a good rest before she teaches again tomorrow. A few closing remarks. Thank you for being here. It means the world, not only to the lecturer, but to those of us that work here, to have a live audience, to have real human beings. We're grateful for the online audience, and we're grateful that people will watch this through the rest of the summer, because it will be available on our YouTube channel, but it means so much to have people here in the seats. So thank you for being here, for your presence, for your good questions. I want to say a word of thanks to our many supporters around the world who make it possible for us to offer these free evening public lectures. If you were grateful for this lecture or for any of the lectures that we offer here, you would be most welcome on your way out to drop some money in that little donation box. And you're thinking, If only I still carried cash. But you probably do carry a phone. And so on that phone, you could just type in rgnt.net/give, and you can give electronically. We do value and need the support of our friends that make it possible for this ministry of our evening public lectures. As I mentioned, this lecture of Dr. Kim's will be available on our YouTube channel probably within about 24 hours. And all of the lectures that have been happening this summer are available, and the ones to come through the remaining 3 weeks of July will all be on our YouTube channel through the end of August. So if you enjoyed this lecture, once it's posted, send the link to friends and say you need to watch this lecture, and check out all the other ones. There's Will nodding his head, and he's in her class. You know how amazing she's been this week, so he's going to tell all his friends. Get a younger generation listening to Dr. Brittany Kim. Thanks, Will. And then I want to invite you all back on Monday. July 14th will be our next evening lecture with Dr. David Smith, especially for those of you who are teachers. Faith, hope, and the purposes of schooling. And Dr. David Smith has been here at Regent before to teach. He is excellent. You will very much enjoy his presentation, so I invite you back Monday, July 14th. Thank you, God bless you, and enjoy the rest of your evening.